Well, I asked, where's the beef? Let's call this for what this is. Oh my God! They are so hopelessly woke. How dare you? That is the intellectual capital of the left today. Give me a break. You are now watching the Daily Roundup.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. This is the Daily Roundup, and I am Adam Soos. Today, I am joined by the incomparable Sid Fizzard. How's it going today, buddy? How are you feeling?
It's doing lovely. We got a little bit of smoke in the air here in Calgary from some of those wildfires. Speculative as to how those started, but otherwise, how you doing, Adam?
Oh, great. You know what? You can save some money if you are a smoker. Put those cigarettes away. Just go outside, take in a big puff, and you'll be set for the day. Before we get into some of these stories, I am doing great, and I do want to cover some of the sort of nuts and bolts stuff, get that out of the way so we can get right into some of these conversations. First off, if you're watching this, odds are, in fact, I'm very concerned if this isn't the case, you're watching us on Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube, or Getter. If you're watching us on YouTube, that's completely fine. We love to have you here. It's great. I do want to encourage you to consider sort of maybe shifting over to one of the platforms that is open to a wide variety of ideas. We want social media platforms and media sharing platforms to not necessarily care about creators' ideas and not necessarily censor creators' ideas, but provide a place where they can share the work that they do. Rumble and some of these outlets are incredible for that. The other really nice thing on Rumble are these Rumble rants. They're a way for you to engage with us, have a conversation, and provide some feedback on the stories. So if you have any thoughts on these stories as we're going through them, or maybe there's a story out there that you'd like us to sort of comment on, we do that sometimes throughout the show, and if nothing else, we make sure to get through all of those at the end. You chip in a few bucks, helps us keep the lights on, helps us do this. But really, I think it's one of my favorite parts of the show, that live interaction. So yeah, please consider participating in that way. You can also support us by joining locals.com. It's a typical social media platform in the sense that you'll see all of our content there, but by joining and supporting us there, you get access to some exclusive content. So those are some of the many ways that you can interact with us, watch this live stream, and watch all the incredible content that we are able to produce with our great team. This week, we're going to talk a little bit about Alberta, but not just Alberta. There are stories across the board. I wanted to touch on a couple reports, but first I thought I'd sort of pick your brain on this, because I think you've had sort of a unique perspective, because I've been covering politics sort of more broadly, talking to a number of the candidates about sort of campaign promises, whether they're being kept, what these UCP MLAs particularly think they have to do to be reelected in 4 years. A couple of reports out on that front. But before we get to that report, or those reports rather, just sort of what's your perspective on the UCP sort of efforts to keep promises? Particularly, I know you've been covering the Sheila Nat Lewis case and a couple other sort of healthcare linked stories. So what's your sort of overall grade on how well the UCP is doing as far as sort of honoring some of the commitments they seem to be making throughout the campaign?
Some of their campaign promises have gone great, and they've, successfully positioned themselves towards advancing those positions. Others, unfortunately, like that of Sheila Nat Lewis is the most specific one, of course, the most timely one. She was denied a life-saving organ transplant because of her vaccination status, and she is an Albertan. And many will remember the campaign, promises from Premier Smith. They were heavily aligned with those who were suffering through the COVID pandemic. The Freedom Convoy, the Coots Blockade. This movement sparked a huge change, not only around Canada but around the world. And Danielle Smith, she did capitalize on that situation, and she advocated for people in those positions, those who ended up giving her the position as the UCP leader, and then she went on, of course, to win against former Premier Rachel Notley. So that promise of theirs to make sure that they get amnesty for those who are ticketed and charged, that promise to make sure the unvaccinated aren't being segregated against in certainly unfair ways, to say the least, that promise is not being upheld. That said, they have done good in many departments. Of course, a lot of people, they sort of have a COVID, pandemic hangover. They don't want to talk about these things anymore. But it's still an issue for everyday Canadians and everyday Albertans. Though, you talk about energy, you talk about some of the other platforms that she's taking on. She is taking a very strong stance on the things that otherwise people would like her to advocate for.
Yeah, and I think that's why I wanted you to touch on this because lots of other things there are good fronts, but we want to remind people out there. Sometimes there's an inclination, particularly among conservatives, to want us to be the CBC for conservatives and sort of herald and champion a particular government. And that's not what we do here. If a government is doing very bad things, we point that out, whether it's Jason Kenney or Justin Trudeau. And if a government is doing very good things, we will sort of share those stories as well. That's our job as journalists, is to sort of follow the truth, expose that, and make it available for you. So I think it is important. Well, there is sort of quite a bit of positivity around Danielle Smith, to touch on that. And before we get into some of the stuff that I would put under what I've lately been calling the good Danielle category. One of the other fronts, and keep in mind, I think after the sort of Jason Kenney hangover, Danielle Smith sort of winning that leadership, not having been elected by Albertans, but having been elected within the party, I think there's a bit of sort of leniency on not enacting things right away. Now, that being said, for someone who was who took over as leader, I think she took action pretty quickly on a number of critical things, sort of energy, to name one for sure, access for our energy and industries to Tidewater, for example, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So she has been strong on some of these issues, certainly strong on standing up to Trudeau. But I think now that there's a full mandate, as in they've won an election, they've won a majority, they won a majority of votes as well. That is significant. So I think now we can truly start sort of criticizing and judging. And given that we are talking about healthcare, I think we can maybe touch on that a little bit. Now, certain things, we had a Fix AHS.ca campaign a little while back. One of the critical things we talked about in there was sort of ambulance wait times, all these sort of, I think it was like called red alerts or red zones where ambulances wouldn't necessarily be available. Lots of that stuff has been issued. I know Adriana Lagrange, the former education minister, now health minister, has been sort of issued a mandate letter and is working on this stuff. But I still think that it seems to be this recurring trend, and I wanted to pick your brain on this as well, where no matter which government it is that's in power, seems like when things get bad and there's waits at hospitals, that they seem to be 8-hour wait times no matter what. And I'm just wondering, do you think that there is a solution for this in the current publicly funded healthcare system? Or do you think, one, there's not enough doctors or nurses, nominally probably because some of them were fired, but also that the system is just not, it's not a free market competing system that can respond to those sort of surges. If you were a private clinic providing services and there was a big surge, that would be very good for business. In these cases, though, the surges are problematic, and it goes back. I can remember when I was a kid hearing about 4 or 5 hour wait times. Now you want to go to the emergency room, 4 or 5 8-hour wait times. Do you think there's something that the government can do to fix it without sort of fundamentally changing how healthcare works in this country?
Well, you do have to fundamentally change it because that's how bad it's being run. I mean, the healthcare system, year by year, it's just digging its grave further and further into the ground. Especially in BC, you mentioned those who are fired because of their vaccine status. I believe it's the BC emergency healthcare workers right now they have legal action against the government for this. If they really wanted to make good healthcare, think about the promise Jason Kenney made. He said that there would be more emergency beds, right? That didn't happen. They made this promise, and then, through, past the hot potato of the blame game, it's just not going to get dealt with. And this is the same thing that we're dealing with every single day, is that there is no real improvement that has come. You do need fundamental change if you want to get the gears going again.
Yeah. So having covered that, I now want to get to, because I didn't have the chance to, Adriana Lagrange peeled out of an event pretty quickly. I only saw her one time throughout all the Stampede, and it was when she was heading out the door. But I did speak to just about every other minister. I spoke to Danielle Smith a few times. First, I had that exclusive interview, which I encourage you to check out. I'm at the Alberta Adolescent Recovery Centre, part of the sort of Help Not Harm .ca coverage that we are doing that's talking about recovery rather than free drug supplies. So it was great to have that opportunity to speak with her. That's something she is very passionate about. Also an issue that has rallied quite a bit of support from First Nations leaders right across this province. So that was incredible. But I want to talk now about the Premier's Stampede breakfast for folks maybe outside of the area by now, you probably are familiar with the Stampede breakfasts. But basically, it's just free pancakes being dished out. Often it's corporations or businesses, or in this case, politicians who are doing the handing out. We can see Smith here. By the way, if we're going to talk about the shirt. The shirt situation. Let's talk about Danielle Smith's exceptional Western shirts. And there's Angela Pitt singing "Friends in Low Places" at the top of her lungs. Incredible stuff. But these events, you have access. I think I called it a dozen, but I think it was really about 14 MLAs and ministers that I had the opportunity to talk to. And the conversations we had were about what the UCP needs to do in order to secure the next victory and potentially even take back some of that sort of critical battleground they lost within Calgary. One of the lines that absolutely killed me, and I'll get your feedback on this too, but Rick McIver said we need basically, and I'm going to paraphrase, but he's like, we need boring, simple government. I love that idea of government taking a backseat compared to Trudeau's activist government. The UCP is like, listen, we're going to enable people to excel, but we're not going to be the ones sort of dictating, mandating, and moralizing what's going to happen within this. What do you think about that sort of approach? And do you think that that'll resonate with Albertans?
Yeah, I think a smaller, simpler government would be a great solution to many of the problems that we have these days. And you think about, there was some news that broke recently about Trudeau and how many new bureaucrats the government has, that he's basically gone on a hiring spree with our money so that we can have, 100,000 new bureaucrats? And tell me, who in this country thinks that the government is better now than it was before? Nobody. It's almost nobody, I guarantee. So yeah, smaller government is in dire need of right now. A government that doesn't want to control every facet of our lives. A government that is simply there to maintain, the fundamental things that a government needs to be there for, like national defense, let's say. Now, again, you can make the argument that the pandemic was a national defense matter, but at the same time, I don't know. It's tricky. Government is a very tricky thing, but I guarantee you if there was less of it and we were left to our own devices through the pandemic, we would have been better off.
Yeah, well, you look at countries like Sweden that seem to be doing just fine, and not only in terms of sort of the sort of medical considerations, but they didn't have this massive economic hit that other countries are still recovering from. One of the questions here, and it was interesting, it was actually local columnist Rick Bell wrote an article on this question, and a bunch of national headlines picked up sort of stories based on the question that I asked Premier Smith during the media scrum, which is great. It's really nice. I mean, imagine if Rachel Notley had won, you just wouldn't be allowed to ask questions. It'd be closing the door. That sort of Trudeau, Gondek, Notley style of politics where they think they're above answering questions would be in full force. But I asked Premier Smith about the ongoing tensions between Ottawa, particularly Trudeau, and Alberta's interests. We sort of talked about, it seems like Quebec can advocate for their interest and the territories can, and BC can do whatever they want. But anytime Alberta does something, whether it be these recovery initiatives that aren't in line with the progressive mentality or advocating for our own industries, the media absolutely dumps on us, and Trudeau intervenes in any way he can to sort of prevent that progress from taking place. And Danielle Smith recently made a comment about sort of wanting to work with Ottawa on things they could come together on when she was meeting with Trudeau. Now, I was saying, listen, is this Kenny saying we're absolutely not going to do vaccine mandates, and then a week later being like, well, you know what, let's work together and figure something out. But no, her statement, and this is why it was picked up, was strong. And she was basically like, listen, if you have a problem with us, we can sort it out in court. And we're going to be advocating on this. She also absolutely blasted so many of the areas that are federal jurisdiction where the government is absolutely failing, and saying they need to stop butting into our business and take care of their things. Again, saying, listen, federal government, take a note from Rick McIver. You need to be smaller. You need to be simpler. We don't need these hundreds of thousands of bureaucrats. I mean, you know what? When elections are close, the mass hiring of bureaucrats who might be fired under a conservative government is strategic. We also see sort of there's been strategic sort of mass immigration efforts to areas where there's very close constituencies that can be flipped. They play these games, and it's certainly concerning. So, but good to see Premier Smith. I was a little concerned after that Trudeau meeting that maybe she was backing off a little bit, but that affirmation seemed to be pretty resolute. We literally at this event we spoke with Rebecca Schultz, Todd, we spoke to just about everyone, and it was incredible, just their availability, their access, and one of the sort of things that I've noticed this past week that was incredibly interesting, and I won't name names, but there was quite a few politicians, both federal and provincial, who in the past have perhaps been apprehensive or unwilling to answer questions, who rather bluntly said, you know what, I don't really care anymore. I don't care if they're going to say you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't be on with this or that. They know that we do real journalism. So it was pretty incredible to have a couple people who haven't really been on before just saying, you know what, a few of them came on a couple times within a few days, were willing to answer questions, be accountable. And I think that's an extremely positive shift to be able to have those conversations, ask questions, hold them accountable. When you do good, fair journalism, you aren't just harping one political party or the other. You're going to get that type of response from people who want to answer questions and who are okay with being held accountable, by contrast to many of the progressive politicians that we're seeing. Another event that took place in Calgary, and it was actually just the day prior to the Premier's breakfast, was a reception of sorts at the Stampede grounds being hosted by Minister Devin Dreeshen. He is the Minister of Transportation and Economic Corridors. I had the opportunity once again to speak to about half a dozen people at this event, but I wanted to talk sort of primarily about this notion of getting our resources to Tidewater, getting our resources to international markets. We're seeing countries overseas. And for folks interested in this topic, I do have an interview with Brian Jean, an exclusive, coming out shortly, probably right after stream, something like that, maybe a little bit later in the day, where we discuss this at length. But there has been a lot of work done and a lot of interprovincial sort of cooperation in order to establish massive economic corridors with hopes to head north and have one provide access to ports and Tidewater for our energy industry sectors. And this would effectively expedite efforts to have pipelines laid down. You wouldn't have to go through quite as much sort of legal rigmarole. There would be a corridor established to do these types of projects. We've seen pipelines canceled left, right, and center, but the governments are really coming together. Smith shared in during the Premier's breakfast that provinces across the board, whether they're left, right, or somewhere in the middle, they are fed up with the federal government and they're ready to get to work together. As someone who came from out east and is now here in Alberta, I'd love to sort of get your perspective on this, because it seems like whether it's automotive or steel or whatever it is, it seems to get government support out east, but our industries, we really have to fight to get our oil out to these markets.
Well, honestly, I can't really give you a fair, interpretation of what it's like coming as an Ontarian, but I can give you the interpretation as somebody from the GTA.
Right.
And in places like that, the government is God. That's how big government is every step in your life, they're there in some way, shape, or form. You look around, you'll see how many buses, that's your main form of transportation in a city, or the subways, because it's just so tight that you want to drive, it's going to take you hours on end. So you rely more heavily on government. And this is the same with kind of every aspect of it. But I would say, it's weird. I'm not for a larger federal government or anything like that, but there's this disposition towards the federal government that's derived from Justin Trudeau being prime minister. It isn't the federal government that's the problem here. It's Justin Trudeau. It's his bad policies, it's his bureaucratic hiring sprees, it's him sending billions overseas, notably in the form of the Ukraine war. That's the latest fad, He's doing all of the wrong things that a federal government shouldn't be doing. He's blowing our money every which way he can, instead of actually helping the premiers and helping the citizens of Canada. So it is a shame to see what our federal government has become. But I think there is still utility in the federal government that people forget about. It's been so poorly used, or misused, I should say, that we often forget about it.
I think people sometimes underestimate sort of the extent to which a culture that's established by a government affects the economy. For example, you look at when the NDP came in, they may have been saying some of the right things, but when push came to shove, we saw a bunch of head offices leaving the province. Danielle Smith is back, and the language is about being open for business. Even before there was necessarily significant changes to the policies that might inspire someone to come here or not, you saw head offices starting to relocate back here. And on a federal level, when you have a country led by someone that is anti-industry, it makes people sort of apprehensive to do business in and with that country. And it also sort of sends a message to other countries, whether it be Biden vetoing the Keto XL or other countries, that we're not really wanting this. We don't really want to get these pipelines out. We don't want to push these industries. There's nonstop talk about putting an end to these industries and being all renewable and solar. Meanwhile, countries that Trudeau sucks up to, like China, are absolutely expediting oil and coal energy manufacturing right across the board. So there's certainly sort of a glaring double standard there. Listen, if you're concerned about sort of the wealth and prosperity of First Nations communities, if you're concerned about work standards, if you're concerned about sort of environmental standards, the best thing that Alberta can do for this province, and Brian Jean echoed this sentiment, or broadly, the best thing we can do for this province, the best thing we can do for Canada, and indeed the best thing we can do for the world right across the board, is exporting our oil. That's the responsible thing for us to do, and it's not going to happen to the extent that it should under this government. This sort of liberal Laurentian elite who continue to hire their friends and grow their government and keep the things going. The average guy, despite all their rhetoric about the middle class, the average guy struggling to make ends meet has nothing in common with them. When the industry goes down, they've got millions in the bank account. It doesn't affect their personal lives. They've still got their cabin out at the lake and a chic downtown apartment or wherever it may be in Toronto. Normal people struggling, it doesn't really matter to them. They would happily see millions of Canadians struggle, have reduced income, all of that stuff, in order to score some virtue points with their buddies. But the real virtue, the real sort of prosperity, and the real advantage for everyone is to have more Alberta energy out there right across the board. Wouldn't you say?
Oh, 100%. I mean, tidal energy, that's not going anywhere. And then you think about solar, you think about wind. How many birds have to die per year because of these wind farms? It's kind of unbelievable when you think about it. Is they're actually more destructive to the planet and to the species of which we're trying to cohabitate with than oil and gas. Same thing with with large batteries. Everyone running around with a Tesla right now. How many slaves basically did it take? Because that's how these rare earth minerals are getting gathered or being mined. These factors aren't being considered. When they talk about the environmentally friendly things they talk about, they're talking about the end product. They're not talking about production, right. Which is a huge deficit to all of us, because you think about, let's take, for instance, a paper straw. I'm almost certain that it takes more effort to create a paper straw than it does to make a plastic straw. So why are we doing this? Because the end production, you see the straws, they, dissipate in your mouth. Oh, that must be environmentally friendly. No, it's just a chemical waste. It's a chemical destruction of our planet, because even though, you can see a paper straw, a plastic straw, pardon me. A plastic straw is not going anywhere. You see it on the street, hanging around with the rest of the garbage, sure. But a paper straw, it dissolves and those chemicals go everywhere. So which one is the better option for the planet? You tell me.
Well, and there's this sort of the arbitrary ideological shifts. Bags and stuff used to be paper, and then we were killing the trees and we needed to stop that. So we switched everything to plastic because that was environmental and we needed to help. And now we're switching the plastic back to paper, which is trees, because that's environmental and that helps.
Well, and on that note, I can't help but laugh every time I see the wooden forks and knives and spoons that they're starting to hand out in place of plastic forks, knives, and spoons, right? Because it's we're trying to save the planet. Let's just get it straight off the tree. Let's start mowing them down, make some forks. When, how many plastic forks could you have made with a much less effort, much less of an impact on the planet, if that's what we're going for?
And so many of these things are literally petroleum byproducts. I'm not going to wear leather. Well, they don't just go around murdering cows to extract leather. People are eating the cows. And it's funny, the same people who will be like, oh my gosh, First Nations, Indigenous cultures, they use all of the animal. Hello, that's what leather is. It's wasting less of the animal. So there's this across the board. But I think you also were sort of dead on there on the electric car front, particularly when you consider so much of this is sort of ideological but not practical. And we called this, as soon as the electric cars started rolling out, the grid can't handle this, and there's going to be rolling brownouts, and that's happened in the United States already. This is the end result. Ultimately, the government, they may have noble ambitions, often they're ideologically misguided, but they envision this sort of perfect utopia, but what we end up with is rolling brownouts and soggy straws. That's the end outcome of their policies. And you can see it across the board. You look at China with their Leap Forward manifesto or whatever they were calling it. People died, people suffered, it didn't work whatsoever. I'm going to make another prediction now that I can tell you right now will come true. Danielle Smith is a big advocate for sort of hydrogen and alternative fuels, and doing it in a way, in that sort of maverick entrepreneurial way where Albertans make money and prosper. Even feeding into the sort of net zero rhetoric, she wants us to sell the net zero brand and be a place that removes carbon from the air. So I think that if these environmental things are going to work anywhere, I think ironically, and it's going to be great when it does happen, it's going to work here in Alberta because of an ultra-conservative government monetizing environmentalism. And people will prosper. The environment, if any of this works, will prosper. But regardless, the funds will be coming in and folks will be getting what they want. I, for one, am looking forward to that, even though I don't particularly care. I'm an environmentalist in the traditional sense, a conservationalist. I'm against the mass dumping that these liberal hotbeds like Montreal and Vancouver are doing straight into the oceans. I've got problems with all of that, but it's incredible to see them taking this thing that is supposed to be in a way anti-Alberta and saying, no, we're going to monetize this. That's about the most Albertan thing I've ever heard of. I think we are overdue for an ad break. We'll jump to an ad break quick, and then we'll jump into the next few stories. Some great stuff to talk about.
In a world plagued by conformity, where truth is distorted, freedom is a distant memory, and Big Brother is always watching. One man, Winston Smith, looks to break through his bleak existence. Introducing the all-new Rebel Illustrated Classics edition of George Orwell's iconic book, 1984. Now, more than ever, in the age of lockdowns, 15-minute cities, and World Economic Forum globalism, everyone must read 1984. Uncover the hidden depths of this literary classic with our exclusive illustrated edition that brings Orwell's haunting vision to life, reborn with a foreword by Ezra Levant and 30 captivating new illustrations by artist Paul Ravoche.
You see that Orwell is not only explaining what might come, but in my opinion, what's already here, even back when he wrote it in 1949, but much more so as we see revealed today, particularly with the last 3 years.
Join the rebellion against conformity. Get your hands on the Rebel Illustrated Classics edition of 1984, now available at buy1984.com.
Yeah, go get that. Critical read in this day and age. If you haven't read 1984, do it. So much of what's going on right now, we say we predicted things. I mean, Orwell was way ahead of the curve. Speaking of predicting things, who could have predicted that Jyoti Gondek, a radical progressive whose first actions included declaring a climate emergency, and who is one of the sort of worst offenders when it comes to callously shutting out journalists, even if they politely request an interview or want to ask a question that's maybe not just pumping her tires. She's not particularly popular in Calgary right now. So she is basically dealing with a 36% approval rating. 55% of respondents remained disenchanted, while 40% strongly oppose their mayor, and only 10% strongly favor her. Sid, why do you think the mayor is not particularly popular here? She won an election not all that long ago.
Well, I mean, how many protests has she banned by now? She banned honking, she banned, going to certain areas. You can't be within a certain distance if you're going to protest one of the LGBTQ, drag queen story reading hours at a public library. People are getting arrested for that. People are going to jail for that. And this is thanks to Mayor Jyoti Gondek. So it really does not surprise me that her support is going down, especially if you look at some of the alternatives in the province, like the UCP, who it seems to be that they're still able to, they have a strong foot in good news, let's put it that way. Whereas Gondek, she has a few small friends, a few, minor journalists in the area. Of course, the mainstream cozies up to her, but really, what is she doing for us? I can't picture anything that she's actually doing for us.
Yeah, no, and I mean, beyond that, not that I'm necessarily for spending massive amounts of money on an arena deal or anything like that, but that that was basically set and ready to go. And with the mass spending on other things that we're seeing from, or we would have certainly seen under the NDP and had seen under the NDP before, that deal was set. People were ready to go. Everything was sort of done, signed, sealed, delivered. She botched that in the eyes of almost everyone. And the New Deal is far worse. Like she messed that up. The Flames were like, all right, later. And they came back and they got a better deal. They slam dunked on her. There's also been this sort of absolute unwillingness and softness on crime that has turned this city into like a borderline Gotham in some areas, things that I would not have seen in the city growing up. They've been just expedited to the point where Danielle Smith basically had to come in, and it almost looked like a principal and a teacher getting in trouble when Smith was there talking about bringing in sheriffs, restoring law and order. That stuff should be handled by the municipality, but the city of Calgary, the Calgary police chief, and Jyoti Gondek, so married to their sort of radical progressive ideas, they have faltered on those fronts. The other thing too is, I mean, we're seeing disapproval for Trudeau significantly. He's dropping. The NDP obviously just lost here. And Jyoti Gondek, obviously low approval, very low sort of strong approval ratings. Part of this does stem from the fact, going back to the election, that you had a lot of sort of strong or semi-strong conservative candidates dividing the vote, and then you had a unified progressive candidate. 36% might be a little bit high, to be honest, because the amount of people who sort of voted for other candidates, and it didn't just occur on the mayoral level. It also happened within the individual wards within the city, where there'd be two or three conservative candidates and one sort of progressive candidate. So the progressive vote was consolidated. I for that reason alone, am not at all surprised to see this. But beyond that, Jyoti Gondek has had a number of stunts where she's like, I'm not answering questions if that person was here. In fact, the other day I ran into Jyoti very, very briefly after an event, and all my gear was packed away. I wasn't rolling. I was leaving the Stampede grounds, and it was sort of a quick intersection. But one time when I saw her, she's like, "Oh, hey," very sort of fake. The second time, she had her whole team with her, and I didn't even approach Jyoti. I was just walking by. I went to someone assuming she was kind of the handler, seeing, oh, like, if I grab my stuff, are you guys willing to do a quick thing? Just because my gear was all put away. And basically security guards kind of backed towards me, and they went, no, they wouldn't allow, and they kind of scurried out of there quickly. They wouldn't even have a conversation saying, no, we're not doing interviews today. That entitlement that we're seeing among progressive politicians who are supposedly for the people, whether it be Justin Trudeau, whether it be Rachel Notley, or whether it be Jyoti Gondek, who she has this massive entourage. Mayors in Calgary used to just walk around and talk to people. Now everywhere she goes for a coffee, there's security. They take themselves so seriously, more seriously than Trudeau's people. Those people will smile and say hi at the very least before shutting you down. So this air of entitlement is something else. I don't. Have you had any sort of personal encounters or experiences?
Not directly with Jyoti Gondek. However, I can speak to. I'll address the Sheila Annette Lewis story that I brought up in the beginning. I spoke to Danielle Smith about this in passing, and she sent an email response to my question. She actually answered the questions I had about Sheila Annette Lewis. And if you want to find out more about that story, go to organsnotcoercion.ca. We have a petition that we're going to hand to the health minister. But when I pose these questions to the NDP, it's radio silence. They will not answer questions. Jyoti Gondek, I've seen her walk away, not even refuse to answer a question, simply walk away from the microphone because she doesn't want to answer questions. Rachel Notley evicts independent journalists from her events simply because she doesn't want to answer her any questions. Justin Trudeau, I mean, somehow myself and Angelica, we were at the Justin Trudeau George Chahal Stampede breakfast, and we tried, obviously he doesn't let us into the events, and the day previous we were actually denied entry to the Danielle Smith Justin Trudeau meeting that took place here in downtown Calgary. So Trudeau obviously doesn't want us at these events. He seemingly couldn't deny our presence at that one, so we tried to ask as many questions as we could. And of course, he didn't answer a single one. He's just there for the marathon selfie taking and, hi, how are you? Good to see us. That's all he's there for. He's not there to have a serious conversation. He's not there to ask questions that people want answers to.
Yeah. And you know what's wild? And Ezra Levant, our boss, absolutely did it. It was like such a good question to Danielle Smith about, if she's going to take questions from the CBC after they brutally lied about her. You know what's incredible is and I mean, I know there's folks out there who aren't fond of Tyler Shandro. To be honest, I was probably one of the staunchest critics of what he did during COVID-19. In fact, a couple stampedes ago, I rolled a giant billboard truck featuring footage of pastors being arrested and children crying, and was asked very politely by security and police to leave or I'd be charged with trespassing. So Tyler Shandro is probably the person in this province, maybe Jason Kenney as well, and I think it was completely fair. I think it was within the realm of sort of journalism, but probably the person I've given a harder time, probably harder than Jason Kenney, probably harder than even Justin Trudeau, though, I mean, we've done our fair share of fair criticism there. But Tyler Shandro, despite all of that, afterwards, when he was doing some good work on, say, firearms rights, I would go up to him, I would ask him if he'd answer a few questions, and he would say, certainly. If anyone sort of has a right to not that I think any politician has a right, but if anyone were sort of semi-justified in saying, you know what, I'm not going to talk to you, you've been a little bit tough on me, it'd be someone like that. But he understands that politicians are accountable despite all of his failings, and he every time was willing to stand there, even if there wasn't a media scrum, I could approach him. He would stand there, take a few questions, thank me for my time, and move on. Jason Kenney, too, despite all the criticism, to his credit, I approached him often when there was no media availability, asked him for a few questions, a couple of these times when he was frankly probably a little bit upset with the fact that we made him commit to not bringing in vaccine passports and then called him out when he broke that promise. But he was willing to take questions, answer questions, sort of do all of that stuff. That is what politicians are supposed to do. You don't simply get to say no because you don't like someone being critical of you, particularly when that criticism is fair and relatively sort of objective. It's here's what you did. This is not what people want. What's your response? Politicians need to be willing to answer those questions.
Well, and rest in peace to Jason Kenney and Tyler Shandro. Maybe there's a reason they're gone.
You know what? That's I'm still honestly, despite everything that happened, I think that I mean, it ranged from like 10 to 20 to 50 vote margin by which Tyler Shandro lost. I think that is seriously concerning because the CBC lied for 6 months and Tyler Shandro's name, despite the fact he did his best to exonerate himself, which some folks accuse him of sort of rolling over on Smith on. But the fact that he was rolled into that story and that scandal that was effectively largely fake news, the CBC has retracted, the NDP refuses to apologize. I guarantee you that cost that seat for the UCP. 100%. There's no way there wasn't at least a couple hundred vote swing because his name was dragged through that dirt as well. So, but yeah, you look at Casey Madhu, you look at Jason Copping, you look at Tyler Shandro, you look at Jason Kenney, the people who were sort of some of whom were up in the Sky Palace, the people who were the key perpetrators, whether in positions as health minister or in the justice position, well, they aren't around anymore. So I guess to some extent, the NDP didn't win, and all the greatest sort of violators of those rights, well, they've been shown the door. So let's call that a victory for democracy, shall we? Lots to get through. Let's sort of fly through some stories before our next ad break. New Alberta Finance Minister Nate Horner still eyeing pension plan and sort of tax collection efforts. Many of these things are already being done in Quebec, but when it's done in Alberta, it's problematic because we're not allowed to have those rights or assert our autonomy in any way, shape, or form, obviously. You know what? I'm not going to lie to you. I'm one of the only things that the federal government does right, the Canadian pension plan actually invests better than most major investment firms that they'd consider as an alternative for the Canadian pension plan. That being said, putting that sort of consideration aside, Albertans pay way more into the pension, and the pension is going to see massive issues. There's a book called Generation Screwed that talks about the sort of the algorithm or the math for determining how much people need to pay into pensions was when people were retiring at like 74, people are now retiring much younger than that, and they're cashing in on those pensions for much longer. So for the pension system to continue, our generation is going to be paying a lot of money into that to keep that going. And my opinion is the more money the federal government gets, the more likely they're to make a big mistake with it. I am for subsidiarity, which means bringing it down to the smallest government possible. So should we be collecting our own taxes and then remitting to the federal government after we've internally managed it what we feel is right? Absolutely, in my opinion, no questions whatsoever. Should we carefully continue to consider internalizing our sort of pension plan? I think there may be wisdom in that because of this sort of long-term perspective and prospects of what the pension situation might look like. That being said, I can see the federal government playing games and holding on to our money. There'd be a lot of ifs and buts in order to see that happen. What's your perspective on this?
The government should not have any of our money. All of our money should stay in our pockets. If they're doing that well, then they'll make money somehow. But they don't. I mean, what federal program is actually, fully, truly rewarding all Canadians? I think it's pretty hard to find one. I mean, look at the efforts they put on changing the passport we have.
Yeah.
What the heck is going on here? Is this the thing that matters? No, it isn't. And it's time and time again, these things come up. Is the government is wasting money on things we don't need. Yes, there might be a little, you might need to grease the wheels a little bit here and there to make sure the government is functioning, but it shouldn't be a vacuum cleaner. It should not be a vacuum cleaner for our money. You shouldn't have to get taxed when you get paid and then get taxed when you buy something and then get taxed on every single aspect of your life. It's a little too much. And, we've done this for a while. We've made a good go at taxing citizens, but, maybe it's time to give that a rest and give people a break. I mean, people are starving. People are, they're arguing, or not arguing, but people are complaining across the country about how expensive bread is, how expensive the basic necessities of life are. And what are they doing? They're taking our money and making everything more expensive.
Yeah. We're going to talk a bit about, and I've got a report coming up potentially today or tomorrow where I talk to a whole bunch of ranchers about, for maybe folks out there who don't understand what is driving the inflation, costs, food, all of that stuff. We're going to talk about that soon. But before I sort of transition into that, I do want to touch on another story. And this is that of Nathaniel Pawlowski. So Sid, we got the call that potentially there might be a warrant out. You were actually at the airport that night in case something happened. And a bunch of people on Twitter were like, why aren't you covering this story? Well, as soon as it happened, you were on your way to the airport. I'd already arranged for a Monday morning interview with Nathaniel Pawlowski. That is out now, where the record is set straight on this. So in case people haven't had a chance to check that story, I don't know if it's been discussed on stream yet, but I figured we may as well sort of clear the air, and that's exactly what Nathaniel Pawlowski did, is set the record straight. So effectively, he was giving this incredible speech, and I think that's really the story. I mean, he was giving testimony in European Parliament, got a standing ovation, a sort of cry for help as far as what is happening in this country, particularly with the arrest of his dad and a number of other pastors throughout COVID-19. So that should have been the main story, but this other thing sort of distracted from it, unfortunately. So what happened was, on his way back to Calgary through Montreal, he was stopped, and effectively, and they showed him the screen, there was he says there was a flag indicating that there was a warrant. So they checked it out. They said it was a municipal matter in Calgary. So he'd just given a big speech critical of the government, and after what his family has been through with numerous arrests, time spent behind bars, some of that time spent behind bars on charges now that have now been successfully appealed, I'll remind you, there was understandably a fear that there was something happening as far as a reprisal. Now, we very quickly, because we're always about following the truth wherever it leads, we reached out to the Calgary Police Department, and in relatively short order, they said, no, other than sort of pre-existing things, there's no warrant, no investigation, nothing, and we're not planning an arrest against Nathaniel Pawlowski. So we relayed that message to Nathaniel and shared it, obviously, with everybody on the news in order to get that message out. So we sat down and had a conversation where he said, listen, he doesn't know if pressure mounted and they changed their minds and pulled that back, if there was an error in the system, whatever may have happened. But for folks out there who I had a couple people messaging me, contacting, tweeting, he lays the full story down. So I'll encourage you to go check out that report. On that note, when we get back, we're going to talk about ranchers, sort of the agricultural emergency, what's happening, all that stuff. But before that, we'll jump to a quick ad break.
How in the world could such a small group of people with limited resources change world history? But in fact, that's happening, and it's the power of the truth. The truth is like kryptonite.
Healthcare isn't in some sense working very well. Foster Colson is thinking about this. He's got a new company, an online healthcare platform called the Wellness Company.
Telehealth company called the Wellness Company.
The Wellness Company.
The most popular product is the detoxification supplement that features nattokinase. Nattokinase is the only enzyme that we're aware of right now that dissolves the spike protein. Spike protein is loaded in the body with the COVID-19 infection and definitely with the vaccines. We've been completely accurate on the spread of the virus, early treatment, on the deficiencies in hospital care, and now the deaths that are occurring after vaccination. This is a human outrage, and it's occurring at the end of a hypodermic needle. Isn't it interesting? Natural substances combating this man-made disaster.
No matter what, God will bring us through. And I said, we will not bow down to your gods.
For tickets, showtime details, and to see the trailer, please go to SaveTheChristians.com.
Yeah, incredible film. Definitely be sure to go check that out. The other thing that I wanted to mention really quick is we have some incredible new merchandise. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, Sid, but in relation to that film, I got like a hoodie and a shirt, but there's some incredible stuff, some scripture on there, a Sacred Heart image in one of the hoodies, some really good stuff at rebelnewsstore.com. So if you're a Christian out there who likes to represent your faith sort of on your sleeve, this stuff is cool. Yeah, there we have it pulled up there. I have the red shirt there in the top right. Really great shirt to get some compliments on the street from it. So go to rebelnewsstore.com, pick that up. If you haven't used the code yet, you can use the code Adam10 to get 10% off your first order. So grab a shirt, grab a hoodie. I got that hoodie with the black one on the bottom left there. I got it in the maroon with the white, and it looks really cool. I'm a big fan of it. So yeah, maybe get the same hoodie as me, and we can be a team. Speaking of teams that we're on, I am a big supporter and advocate for farmers, ranchers. I don't know about you, but if I go hungry for too long, I get cranky, and I put two and two together, and I realize the people who work around the year get up a couple hours before I'm up every morning, and they ensure their animals are fed before they're fed, in order to ensure that I, at the end of the year, can have a nice chunk of steak to enjoy. But farmers are struggling. There's a couple stories here, and it's interesting that they popped up. As yesterday, I was at the Calgary Stampede, and I talked to about a dozen ranchers. This report will also be available soon. But it's heartbreaking. Even the day before, I wasn't even talking about ranching in the report, and a number of ranchers approached me saying that they're having to sell stock, they're having to get rid of head of cattle, even some of their sort of premium cattle, and they'll usually keep maybe 20 or 30 cows to breed for the next year, their best head. They're having to sell those off because they can't afford to feed them throughout the winter. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And you'll have sort of costs in addition. We can jump to the first story now because this sort of ties into it. But there are certainly natural factors that contribute. Farmers are used to dealing with this. Sometimes there's drought, sometimes there's plagues, locusts, whatever it may be, affecting crop, even flooding sometimes. But this article here from CTV says grasshoppers, dry conditions creating agricultural emergency in parts of Alberta. Walking through Del Pratt's backyard north of Oyen, Alberta, it isn't for the faint of heart these days as a cloud of grasshoppers bursts from the ground at step. If your shirt's not tucked in, it's going to be filled with grasshoppers. Beyond that, there's talk of the grasshoppers here, but there's also a massive drought. So there are issues hurting farmers right across this province. It's brutal. And make no mistake, when there's not enough grass there, when there's issues like this, that drives down the amount of whether it be grain or beef or whatever it is available, which drives up costs for you. So you will see an increase down the line in costs as a result of this because there simply won't be as much out there. It is very much an agricultural disaster. But part of what I really wanted to talk to, in addition to these environmental factors that are to an extent outside of people's control, is the factors that are within people's control. And this was a sentiment that I've heard from basically all of these ranchers. it's difficult enough with the carbon tax, increasing taxes, inflation, everything, particularly when the raises we're getting, most folks, particularly farmers and ranchers, well, they aren't matching that rate of inflation by any metric. It's difficult to feed your family, but imagine if you're feeding 100, 300 more head of cow, and the price of hay has gone up, say, double. And that's what I'm hearing. I asked about the average increase in price, and when the folks were originally telling me, I figured they were talking about over 10 years, over 20 years. No, some of them said that hay's gone up 30-40% in 2 years. Fuel costs have gone up 15-30%. In the course of 2 to 3 years, we're talking about farmers having their costs go up 20-40%. And the fact is, they can't just absorb those costs. Maybe if you get all of your sort of history from Yellowstone, or your experience of ranching is from that show, you might think, oh, well, they're loaded. That's not the case. These are people who do what they do because they love it. They love working with animals. It's great to be able to get up on your horse, but they're not doing it to get rich. That's pretty plain for everyone to see. Now, sometimes the packers, the grocery stores, all that stuff, those folks can cash in a little bit better. But yeah, it's tough out there, and things like the carbon tax, well, it's certainly not helping. Sid, how much can you relate to the sort of farm experience? You're just trying to make ends meet, and then it seems there's always some additional charge coming in from the government.
In the wrong way. All right, let me just say, there's grasshoppers, dry conditions creating agricultural emergency in parts of Alberta. Eat the grasshoppers. Why don't you just eat the bugs? Eat the bugs and be happy. This is clearly a simple solution. If you just get a net, you can catch the bugs and you can feed them to the cows, or you can eat them yourself, and everything will be fine and dandy. Now, I'm saying this obviously as a joke, but that's basically the same kind of response they get from the federal government. Because the federal government doesn't care. They keep on providing them with solutions that end up doing more harm. That is the reality that we live in under Justin Trudeau's federal government. And Danielle Smith, I think, certainly should be doing more to help these individuals. Of course, who's to say how much can be done on her part? I don't want to, say she can save everyone's life here. But at the end of the day, the federal government is just making it worse and worse and worse for these people while advocating for these stupidest ideas on the planet.
And you know what I love? One of the things that I had a conversation with, and I think it'll be in the video as well, I talked to a rancher about, what can the government do to help? And this, I loved it. It was the most Albertan thing ever. I can't remember. I think it might have been a dude with a big wad of chew-in, so it was perfectly fitting. But he was saying, well, we don't want the government to do anything. We don't want handouts. We just want them to stop sort of beating us down. And adding like every time you drive your truck, one guy was saying to get sort of horses down the road, it used to cost 40 cents a kilometer, it used to be 40 cents a mile. Then it became 40 cents a kilometer, and now they're looking at $1 a kilometer to get their animals around. And all of those costs absolutely add up. It's devastating, but it was incredible to have the sentiment of listen, I can do this. I can get by. We're gritty. We're tough. We have determination, but you can't keep hammering us down. And that's what this federal government is doing. They want to be left alone, and the federal government simply won't give them that break. It was funny too. I love that you touched on that sort of crickets grasshopper thing, because one of the other sheep farmer, or a sheep herder, I don't know, a shepherd. Let's say a shepherd. She's like, yeah, they want me eating crickets or grass. And meanwhile, there's this sort of sheep right between us. And I said, yeah, if it's between crickets, grass, and this handsome fellow, I'm eating this handsome fellow. Yeah, that's so funny, that constant push. That really would be their solution to this. Another article here, we'll just quickly zip through it. I also talked to pork producers. And just to put this in context, imagine the amount of work that goes into raising a pig over the course of a year. And these people are raising lots of pigs. For every single pig that Alberta pork producers puts out, they are losing right now, because of costs, because of inflation, because of all this, they're losing about $40 a pig. So you put all that work in, you get them out the door, you're trucking them down there, all of which at this point, they're literally trying to sort of recoup some of their losses. These are people who wake up when the sun comes up, they're working hard all day. Most of us probably couldn't survive a couple of weeks out on these farms. And they're doing it to lose $40 a pig. That's heartbreaking to me. And they're having to get rid of pigs. I know I talked to one farmer who, compared to the cattle industry, there's like a potential to put them out to pasture. There's a little bit more sort of leeway. The pig production process, it's far more nuanced, and there's far sort of tighter deadlines. So these industries are suffering. And once again, if you think bacon's expensive now, they're losing money on these pigs. They're having at times to cull herds because they can't afford to lose money like this. It's a loss, not a loss leader, but just a loss to keep these animals alive. We are running so tight on time. I think we'll rip through a couple more stories here. I don't know if we'll do our last ad break. But in fact, let's just do this one story. Let's talk about the Screen Actors Guild strike. I don't think any of the other ones are critical for us to get to. Avatar and Gladiator sequels look to be hit as actors walk out. Some of the concerns here, which I find, I'm not worried about being replaced by AI, but if your script writing is so rote and your performance is so generic that you're striking because you're afraid that Chat GPT is going to replace you, maybe you shouldn't be working in creative industries. What do you think?
In a sense, I do agree with you. However, I know for a lot of artists and creators, it is the unprecedented data mining that these AI generators are doing on their
Right.
private platforms. They're collecting information from everyone everywhere in any which way they can. So let's say you're an artist or a creator and people start making music, AI generated music with your voice or your
Yeah.
special licensed keys or whatever like that. There are those issues which I think are going to remain relevant, and I think it's going to remain something that needs to be strongly considered. And there's artists, sure, but then you get into universities, you get into governments. I mean, the CIA left all of their, I think it was the CIA, pardon me if I'm getting this one wrong, but one of these large agencies, such as the CIA, had open access to all of their hardcore malware devices online for hackers to just come and grab. And now imagine if you have an institutionalized agency that's using AI and their bread and butter is turning data into a response that the user would most like to see. Well, obviously, the more data, the better. So you're going to go through every single channel you possibly can. And there are going to be a lot of issues with that. Though at the end of the day, the data is there. If one person could get it, someone else is going to get it as well. I think the scariest thing about AI, though, isn't about the data collection, it's about the filtering. Especially you think about Google, maybe in the beginning days of Google, you search for something and it'll provide you the most precise answer. And then it kind of transitioned into providing you with the answer that is the most marketable or the most financially rewarding for themselves. And that's the same thing that AI is doing. These AI, like ChatGPT and stuff like that, they will limit the response that they give you. You're not getting an unfiltered, genius AI answer. You're getting an answer that was constructed to avoid certain things while still providing you with a sufficient answer.
Yeah, and there's sort of two sides of this. You definitely got that right. But I think part of this too, obviously, if there's sort of efforts like I don't want my image being recreated or I don't want a monetization of my work, I get all of that. But does this not sort of have a bit of the air of like censoring the internet? Like people are going, most of the people who are making sort of AI songs using Drake's voice and making a song that sounds like him, this isn't official industries. This is trolls on the internet, hackers. I'm wondering what, and there's more to this conversation with regards to the strike, including sort of shares from streamers and all that stuff. Hollywood is changing, they're adjusting. It isn't as sort of unified and controlled as it used to be. But continuing the conversation on this AI front, it isn't studios putting out this sort of troll AI content. It's people online. It's kind of like the Metallica lawsuits going back to like, oh, you're not allowed to pirate our music. Well, people are going to do this on the internet. You can't regulate. There's always going to be a moonshine market out there. People are always going to be doing nefarious things. I understand concerns, whether it be with deep fakes or sort of voice simulation deep fakes, but how do you regulate this? What's a strike going to accomplish on that front?
It's really tough to say, but you mentioned how this is in a form censorship. Well, AI chats are going to be the next generation of censorship, because it's not like, oh, you can't see this. It's allegedly unfettered access to the data that they have. But what are they going to do? They're going to create not imaginary, but invisible barriers to this information. We see censorship online all the time, and more often than not, it'll show you that you can't see something, or it'll be blocked. But now you won't even know that there are things that are being blocked. That is the next generation of censorship that they're aiming for. But we'll see how that goes.
The one thing that I do sort of agree with here, and there was this quote, I think someone tweeted it. So whoever you are, I don't remember, but cheers and credit to you. That this like, it's like almost the opposite of Star Trek, where Chat GPT and AI are making art and writing poetry while we do the medial labor. It's the opposite of what we'd hope. You'd hope these things would be used more critically. One thing here, though, that I do think matters, and one of the things that they are sort of decrying is, and I'll read from the article, they propose that our background performers should be able to be scanned, get paid for 1 day's pay, and then that company should own the scan of their image, their likeness, should be able to use it for the rest of eternity. So eventually what you could see here is these sort of massive studios just banking and filling backgrounds with AI audiences and crowds. Now, I think it might get to the point where the uncanny valley, sort of knowing something right, isn't an issue. I don't think it's coming anytime soon, though. But that is concerning, because basically then you'll have the studios and the odd stars being incredibly wealthy, but so many other people in the industry sort of devastated. And if part of this is these sort of actors and folks saying, no, the people who aren't millionaires like us are going to get screwed by this, and that's where we're taking a stand. On that front, putting the other sort of stuff aside, I laud them, because it's not very often that you see sort of Hollywood millionaires, directors, producers standing up for the little guy in the industry. So on that front, we don't give Hollywood and these folks too much love, but yeah, I think on that front that might be something appreciable.
Yeah, no, it's the speed at which AI is improving or involving itself in further industries is unprecedented, obviously. And it is something that's going to spark, and has already sparked, some major concerns. While at the same time, its progression does almost seem inevitable. We will all eventually have it in our pockets, just as everyone's had Google. People are still catching on, but it will get to that point. We'll all have our own unique, individualized sidekick, and everything that we put into that AI, it will remember, and it will use against you at some point in the future.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm hoping the sort of capacity for AI and for work, like medial sort of tasks, to be done, it is great. But I do think you're dead on there. Is probably what it's going to be doing, rather than curing diseases and filing paperwork and doing our taxes extremely efficiently and making our life easier. Maybe it'll do that stuff too. But probably what people are going to use it for is to edit their photos superficially and put out sort of borderline catfish creations of themselves, generate social media posts and contents that aren't creative and don't necessarily contribute to moving forward or evolving, but fit extremely narrowly and in a very sort of superficial way to what the most popular post or what the most popular response or the most fitting thing would be. How appropriate, going back to 1984. That is a real concern, that we sort of lose our humanity as this technology begins to take over and tell us this is what people want to hear. This is the most logical sort of public opinion.
And I should say, you say when this technology takes over, but maybe I should specify in my own belief, it's not when the technology takes over. It's the fact that the technology is inseparable from a controller. There's always going to be somebody who controls the technology, who controls the code. What happens if we implement across the nation, ChatGPT 4 legal edition replaces our lawyers, replaces our judges, replaces the clerks in these courthouses? Well, sure, maybe they'll be automated and allegedly will do exactly what they're supposed to do every time. Humans are corruptible. So is the thing that a human creates. Any AI device or machine or processing power that we use will always inevitably be corruptible because it is us that are making it.
Yeah, 100%. And you know what though? That I think that's entirely true. But if you look at Canada, maybe it won't be the case in the next election. But how many times has Justin Trudeau won? The NDP did win in Alberta. I don't even necessarily think that there has to be an individual sort of controlling it, because what will ultimately happen is those mentalities that lead to someone like Justin Trudeau being elected. Now, don't get me wrong, there was influence from media, all that sort of stuff, but this does bring us a little bit of the way closer to the hive mind, when not only is your sidekick something that's supposed to help you, but it becomes a little Jiminy Cricket. It's constantly whispering in your ear the direction you should be pointed. And when it's basing the direction you should be pointed on what absolutely everybody else thinks and creating an average response to that, or the most sort of expected response to that, how much is that going to make us more inclined towards groupthink, and how much is that going to affect the capacity for individual thought?
Well, and let me just say one last thing. I'm thinking about Elon Musk and, that chip that he wants to put in your brain. Let's say you get that chip and you get, ChatGPT-4, of course, we keep using the same example, installed in this chip that's installed in your brain. How do you get that out? If somebody decides that, and somebody with the wherewithal to hack into that system, tells ChatGPT, okay, every 3 seconds send this person a message, right? Yeah. For their entire life. Moving forward, now every 3 seconds you get a random advertisement in your head from somebody who you didn't want there, who you can't get out. That is this concern. And that's the same concern with the vaccine. Again, This is a bit of a dying issue, but with that, there's no going back. You can't untake the vaccine. There was that one advertisement, which I hope that proves to be very useful for a lot of people, that allegedly, does something to the spike proteins. I won't talk too much science because I'm not sure. I think we're still on YouTube. But it's the same thing. That permanent change to your life is very hard to undo. And once you go through that threshold, you may more likely than not regret it.
But Sid, they wouldn't do that unless it was for our own good, or if there was a very serious global issue that they had to address. You have to trust them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's exactly it. Remember, first the planet's going to explode because of heat. Now it's going to freeze over. Now it's going to heat up too much. Yeah, they can't pick a lane. They never will be able to.
Yeah, they certainly will not, but they love to try and force people to pick a lane, and whether it's something they put in your arm or something they put in your brain, they will certainly use it to achieve those ends. That's all the time we have for today. We've gone a little bit over. Great to have these conversations. Sid, I want to thank you so much for joining me, for weighing in on all this. I want to thank all of the folks back in the studio for making this possible. We couldn't do it without them. And as always, for everyone watching at home, thank you so much for tuning in.